I'm claiming fair use to cover the images and video clips contained in this video. They're here to give background and illustrative information regarding the topic. I acknowledge that all material belongs to the copyright holders. As this video covers and discusses horror films, there may be some images shown which might distress more sensitive viewers. If this is you, and you decide to continue, don't come crying to me later. Right, now that that's out the way, let's begin. So, I'm really excited to make this video. I've taken a break out of my animation project to do this, but in a roundabout way it relates to them. I've had a lot of influences growing up, but these combine two of the major ones: horror films and Garbage Pail Kids. By the way, if you haven't seen any of my animations, then check some of the 15-second horror film shorts out on my channel. This year's entries are going into production next month. So, I got these off of eBay from America. Garbage Pail Kids, Revenge of Oh the Horror Ible. Garbage Pail Kids, for anyone who doesn't know, were a sticker series which was big in the 80s and was a parody of Cabbage Patch Kids. They were subversive art cards showing kids in dangerous and fatal situations, or kids with surreal abnormalities. Parents hated them, schools banned them, but kids loved them. They even made a live-action film, but I'll discuss that particular cinematic abomination in another video. There was always an element of horror running through the series, and now they've gone full circle with this set, which pays tribute to classic, cult and modern horror. I'm going to go through some of the cards and discuss the films they're influenced by. I can't go through all of them because there's just so many, but I might make a follow-up video covering the ones that I've missed out here if this one's popular enough. So, with that being said, let's dive on in. So I'm going to kick off with one of my favourites. This is Fractured Francis and Metal Plate Nate in the slashers subcategory. Each card has an A name and a B name, and it's based on Chop Top, played by Bill Moseley in the 1986 comedy horror sequel Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, which is my absolute favourite Texas Chainsaw film and definitely my top 10 films of all time. Chop Top was a Vietnam vet who was injured in the war and had a metal plate fitted. He was also part of the cannibal family from the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but was away at the war during the events of the original movie. Throughout the film, he carries a metal coat hanger around and uses it to scratch off pieces of the skin around the plate and eats them. Bill Moseley is often cited as a highlight of the film and brings a manic, over-the-top energy to the role.
Before I start kicking your ass, some kind of crazy booger just skits through here.
Nah, booger? How big?
Big crazy booger. That's all but, bro.
Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 is a massive departure from the original. Whereas the first film was a gritty, almost documentary-style horror film, Part 2 is a balls-out, off-the-wall, pitch-black satire comedy of 80s consumerism and capitalism. There was talk of a spin-off film featuring Moseley as Chop Top, entitled All American Massacre, directed by Tobe Hooper's son, but it seems unlikely to see the light of day, either due to rights or financial issues. I was delighted to see him here in this set. Illustration on this card is by Brett Engstrom. Continuing the theme, and also in the slasher subset, we have Massacre and Bubba Burger. So this design seems to be based on the original Leatherface played by Gunnar Hansen in the 1974 Texas Chainsaw Massacre. They seem to have conflated parts 1 and 2 for this card. Whilst the cannibalism was heavily implied in the original, it was front and centre in its immediate sequel. So the place of burgers is more in keeping with the sequel. Plus, he was referred to as Bubba in part 2. Again, it's great to see my favourite iconic character get his own card. It's a testament to the late Gunnar Hansen that the character is such alive to this day. He portrayed Leatherface as a vicious killer, but also as a terrified guard dog. His house is suddenly overrun by strangers and he has no idea where they're coming from. He also has the 3 personalities depending on which mask he's wearing. The killer mask, which this card is based on. Then there's the servile domestic character, which comes out when he has the old lady face on. Then finally there's the pretty woman face he wears to look nice for dinner. I had the privilege of meeting and corresponding with him back in the late 90s, and he was a lovely chap. And the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is quite rightly one of the benchmarks of classic horror, and its influence is still felt today. And the illustration on this card is by Joe Simcoe. We're going 3 for 3 with Toby Hooper here. This is from the retro horror subset and is Blood Tucker and Crooked Kurt. This is based off Reggie Nalder's character Kurt Barlow from Toby Hooper's 1979 miniseries Salem's Lot. Barlow was the chief vampire and has a really effective first appearance. Salem's Lot is another one I regard really highly. I saw it around the time I was either 10 or 12 and it scared me so much that I ended up sleeping with a crucifix under my pillow for 2 weeks. The character of Barlow was changed from the novel. In this he is obviously more based on the Max Schreck Nosferatu vampire and is mute except for the odd growl, whereas in the book he is more human-like and chatty. At 3 hours it could be considered quite slow. There's a few different cuts of the film, but it is one of my favourite vampire films and you should definitely give it a go if you've never seen it. Illustration on this card is by Brent Engstrom. This is from the 80s horror subset and it is Birthday Kate and Reanimated Nate. And this is from the 1982 George Romero and Stephen King film Creepshow. Yet another one I hold in really high regard and have endless fun watching. Creepshow was an anthology horror film based on the old EC horror comics, such as Tales from the Crypt, Vault of Horror, and Haunt of Fear. This card is based on the opening story entitled Father's Day, in which an abusive old father, who was killed by his daughter after he murdered her lover, returns from the grave for revenge. The card is a homage to the final shot of that story, in which the erstwhile Nathan Graham declares proudly that
It's Father's Day, and I got my cake. Happy Father's Day.
Creepshow definitely captures the feel of those old EC comic books, with its illustrated fades both in and out of the segments, along with the caption boxes at the top of the screen. The cast is absolutely top-notch in this, including Ted Danson, Leslie Nielsen, Adrian Barbeau, Stephen King, Hal Holbrook, and Ed Harris. Everyone takes it seriously enough to avoid sending it up, but captures the larger-than-life elements present in the old comics. Again, if you haven't already seen it, check it out. It was revived as a series on Shudder last year, and I believe a second series is either in production or will screen later on this year. Illustration on this card was by Joe Simcoe. Continuing with the 80s horror subset, this is Brandon Brewster and Holy Walter, based on the character of Evil Ed from 1985's Fright Night. Played by Stephen Jeffries, Evil Ed was the friend of the hero Charlie Brewster, whose catchphrase was a mocking,
"Oh, you're so cool, Brewster."
He was depicted as a bit of a loner who was a fan of horror and the occult, but is ultimately turned into a vampire. Fright Night is a cracking vampire film and has a fantastic Boy Who Cried Wolf premise. The idea that a horror fan is convinced that a real-life vampire has moved in next door, but nobody believes him, was absolutely brilliant. It's elevated by superb performances by Chris Sarandon as Jerry Dandridge, the chief vampire, and Roddy McDowall as Peter Vincent, the ex-horror host who turns reluctant vampire killer hero. It was remade in 2011, and Christopher Mintz-Plasse played Evil Ed. It had its moments, but the original is the superior version and well worth your time. Another reason that I rate Fright Night so highly is because the soundtrack contains Devo and Sparks, two of my absolute favourite bands in the whole world. Illustration on this card was by Joe Simcoe. Another from the 80s horror subset, and this is Halloween Tree and Melting Melvin. And this is based on 1982's Halloween 3, Season of the Witch, directed by Tommy Lee Wallace. Halloween 3 is notorious in the franchise as the one without Michael Myers. Apparently this was an attempt to reboot the series as a seasonal anthology using the holiday as a backdrop to tell various different horror stories. It didn't work. Michael Myers was too closely identified with the Halloween title and people were pissed when this came out. It's actually my favourite Halloween film, and I might be damaging my horror credentials here, but I was never really hooked by Michael Myers. Anyway, this card is based on the infamous scene in Halloween 3 in which a young boy has his head melted and turned into snakes and bugs through a television signal beamed at his Halloween mask. I love the Silver Shamrock logo on his trick-or-treat bag. Silver Shamrock was the company that manufactured the masks and was planning to kill a population of children. It's been sanitised here, but I guess the inclusion of the snakes and bugs on this card may have undercut the levity of the artwork. I'm really pleased to see this in the series, and I'm so glad to know that Halloween 3 has developed a cult following. I'm sure it would have been more successful had it not been titled Halloween 3. Illustration on this card is by Joe Simcoe. Here's another from the 80s horror subset. It's Bobby Gum and Revealing Roddy. And this is based on the 1988 John Carpenter film They Live. It stars the late wrestler Rowdy Roddy Piper as Nada, a drifter who rolls into town, picking up a job as a construction worker and joining a shanty town. He discovers that aliens in disguise are keeping the population subdued and docile via a transmitter. This keeps them hidden and also allows them to plant subliminal messages throughout television, magazines and advertising. This is confirmed when he discovers a box of sunglasses which allows him to see past the alien signals. He ultimately teams up with other members of the shantytown to bring down the transmitter and reveal the truth to humanity. Carpenter said that the film was inspired by his disgust of Reagan-era politics and popular culture. He said that everything on the TV was designed to sell you something, and the aliens exploiting Earth's resources were the intergalactic version of unrestrained capitalism. Indeed, the message is still very relevant today, where there's a massive imbalance between the rich and the poor. And it seems like the worst of the 80s never really went that far away. Highlights of the film include a 5.5-minute fight scene utilising Piper's fighting skills, which took 3 weeks to rehearse, the iconic alien design, and the all-time classic line of
I have come here to chew bubblegum and kick ass. And I'm all out of bubblegum.
Like Halloween 3, the card has been sanitised, but it really does capture the great elements of the movie though. In fact, they seem to have summed up the whole film in just this one image, with the bubblegum, ghoul, gun, sunglasses and Rowdy Roddy Piper. It's a great sci-fi horror film based on the story 8 O'Clock in the Morning by Ray Nelson and a comic strip drawn by Bill Ray. Carpenter liked the premise and adapted the tale to what would become They Live. If you haven't seen it, then really do give this one a whirl. It's one of Carpenter's finest. Illustrations on this card is by David Gross. We're into the cult horror subset now, and here we have Veggie Able and Sloshy Joshy from 1990's Troll 2. Troll 2 was originally made as a film called Goblins. It's about a family that moved to a town called Nilbog. That's goblins spelled backwards. The townsfolk are vegetarian goblins in disguise. They have to feed people a poison which mutates them into a plant-type goop, which the trolls/goblins then eat. It's got a reputation as a so bad it's good film, and if you go in with that mindset, it's really good fun. The acting is properly dodgy and the effects are pretty suspect, but it's got heart, and that's why it's got such a cult following.
They're eating her! And then they're going to eat me! Oh my God!
Although it's called Troll 2, it has nothing to do with the film Troll from 1986. Some of the creature designs bear a passing resemblance to the Troll from 86, but it was purely a marketing tactic to call it Troll 2, piggybacking off the cult success of the original. The card shows the protagonist, Josh, being barfed on by the trolls, while the ghost of his grandfather looks on in embarrassment. And it's actually a pretty good representation of the film as a whole. The film spawned a genuinely brilliant documentary called Best Worst Movie, made by Michael Stevenson, the child star of the film. There was a limited edition Blu-ray set released by Eureka in the UK, which contains Troll, Troll 2, and Best Worst Movie, and it's worth picking up for the documentary alone. He turned his embarrassment around and embraced the fact that he was the star of a terrible film that found such love from its fans. Illustration on this card is by Joe Simcoe. Sticking with the cult horror, we're on one of my favourites here. This is Liv Stick and Vanna Vamp from the 1986 film Vamp by Richard Wenk. Vamp is a film about two guys trying to get into a fraternity. AJ, played by Robert Russler, the more confident of the two, tells the jocks during a botched initiation ceremony that they should be allowed to join in exchange for a favour. The favour involves obtaining a stripper for the upcoming frat party, much to the chagrin of Keith, played by Chris Makepeace, the more cautious of the pair. They team up with Duncan, played by Geddy Watanabe, a rich, excitable but unpopular nerdy guy, borrowing his car in exchange for being his friends for a week. They end up in a strip club on the wrong part of town, but are impressed with Katrina, played by Grace Jones. Unfortunately, the whole place is a front for vampires, and AJ is bitten and disappears. Keith begins to look for him, but is attacked frequently, and teams up with a waitress at the club who has a history with him he just can't remember. Together, they must dodge the street gangs and vampires and try to stay alive until morning. From Dusk Till Dawn was definitely influenced by this film. The card is based on Grace Jones's character Katrina, with a blood red wig and iconic metal spiral outfit. Whilst Grace Jones is mute for the majority of the film, aside from a laugh or growl, she's absolutely captivating during her dance, then absolutely horrifying as the Nosferatu-esque vampire. There's some great moments of dark humour, and it's usually categorised under the horror comedies that were a regular feature of the 80s. The film is lit in pinks and greens and has a really distinctive look. Everyone gives a great performance and there's some really funny scenes. The main leads, Robert Russler, Geddy Watanabe, Chris Makepeace and Dee Dee Pfeiffer, are great as the unlikely friends and heroes of the film. Grace Jones, Billy Drago and Sandy Barron are fantastic as the villains of the piece. Sandy Barron in particular is quality as the exasperated club owner who dreams of bigger and better things. He reminds me of Jim Seedow from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre Part 2. I want to shout out Geddy Watanabe as well. He's the comic relief sidekick who has some genuinely funny lines. He's the typical wacky guy you immediately think of in 80s comedies, but he plays Duncan with a sweet, sympathetic edge that you really do feel sorry for him when nobody wants to be his friend. He works well with Rustler and Makepeace, and they're such a fun team to watch. Arrow put out a great release of this film, which is well worth picking up. Arrow, like Scream Factory, really know how to put together a special edition for these sorts of films, and they finally get the love they deserve. I was able to get my copy autographed by Robert Rustler back at the 2015 London Film and Comic Con. Really nice guy, and seemed very happy to know how much the film was appreciated. Illustration on this card is by Brent Engstrom. Another from the cult horror subset, this one is Dead Alive Clive and Sumatran Dan from Peter Jackson's 1992 film Brain Dead, or Dead Alive if you're in America. Once upon a time, before he became a highly regarded Oscar-winning director, Peter Jackson used to create splatter comedies. You wouldn't think that the man who helmed the Lord of the Rings pictures ended the early part of his career by massacring zombies with a lawnmower, but he did. Brain Dead begins with an arrogant anthropologist ignoring local advice and pissing off the natives by capturing a Sumatran rat monkey. He gets bitten and is swiftly dispatched by his guides. The rat monkey is sent off to a zoo in Wellington, New Zealand. Enter Lionel, a man who lives with his domineering and prudish mother. He takes a shine to Paquita, the local shopkeeper's daughter, and whilst on a date at the zoo, Lionel's mother, who's been spying on them, gets too close to the rat monkey and is bitten. She starts turning into a zombie, and the film focuses on Lionel's desperate attempts to keep her contained in secret. It all obviously goes pear-shaped, and the film concludes with guests at a house party fighting off and becoming zombies themselves. During the film, 2 of the zombies have sex and produce a mutant zombie baby called Selwyn. The man went on to win several Academy Awards and a knighthood, so there's hope for all of us. This card is based off a scene towards the end in which a character called Rita has been bitten and passes out. Paquita checks to see how she is, only for Selwyn, the mutant baby, to have ripped her head open from the inside. Again, the card is a wee bit more sanitised than the source material, but that's obviously understandable. It's Jackson's most highly regarded film of his early work, though I personally still prefer Bad Taste. Still, it's worth a gander to see how Peter Jackson started, and is one of the bloodiest, goriest films I've ever seen. Illustration on this card is by Joe Cinco. Jumping into the modern horror subset, we've got Rick R. Treat and Trick or Pete, and this is based on the 2007 film Trick or Treat by Michael Dougherty. Trick or Treat is an anthology film which introduced the character of Sam, who was created as the personification of Halloween. Dougherty lamented that Christmas has Santa and Easter has the bunny, but Halloween has no such associated iconic persona, and thus Sam was created. Sam, as depicted here, appears to be unmasked. For the majority of the film, he wears a burlap sack with buttons attached. Trick or Treat isn't an anthology in the same way Creepshow is. I can only think to describe it like the Simpsons episode 22 Short Films About Springfield, in which the tail end of one segment we suddenly focus on a character who happens to be passing by, which then takes us into the next story. It is a great film, lots of fun and a regular watch for me at Halloween. The stories include a young boy who is fatally punished for disrespecting the customs of Halloween, a group of young mentally challenged people who were murdered by their school bus driver who return for revenge, and a Halloween party in which a demure young lady reveals her terrifying secret. Trick or Treat ended up delayed for several years before its ultimate release. However, it's enjoyed huge success, with it becoming a fan favourite around the holiday. Sam has been immortalised amongst Freddy, Leatherface and Jason in various collectible figures, and fans are still clamouring for a sequel to this day. In fact, Trick or Treat wasn't Sam's first appearance. He featured in a 1996 animation, also by Michael Dougherty, called Season's Greetings. It's a lovely, creepy old school animation and can be found on YouTube. Sam's appearance is a wee bit different, with his mask looking more like a pumpkin than the burlap sack that he sports through the film, although one eye is still a button. It's a great little short and really captures the feel of the season. and I hope that I can make something similarly atmospheric one day. It really is a great film and a lot of fun. If you haven't seen it, it's definitely worth checking out. Maybe for this year's Halloween party. And it's really great that Sam's made such an impression that he has his own Garbage Pail Kid card now. Illustration on this card is by Brent Engstrom. We're back to the retro horror subset again, and this time it's Devilish Damien and Omar Omen from the 1976 film The Omen, directed by Richard Donner. The card is based on Harvey Spencer Stevens as Damien, the devil's son from the original Omen. They've got all the elements there, from his black suit to the cap, and the 666 mark along with the mushroom cloud, indicating the end of the world that the devil's son is supposed to usher in. The Omen is a progression of the Satanic Panic films, which included previous entries such as Rosemary's Baby and The Exorcist. It's got a great cast and some suitably chilling moments. Like The Exorcist, the elements are iconic now. The name Damien is media shorthand for Devil Child, and the 666 birthmark is often used as the mark of the devil. Whilst not having a great deal of dialogue, Harvey gives a really creepy performance as the child in which bad things happen around but can't be pinned directly on him. He sells it as a little boy who is starting to get an inkling of his diabolical purpose in life. My favourite characters are Father Brennan, a priest who tries to warn the family about Damien, played by second Doctor Who actor Patrick Troughton, who meets a grisly end with a broken church spire, and Keith Jennings, played by David Warner, who's a photographer whose pictures show grim forebodings of death and meets a similarly bad end via a pane of glass. The Omen produced 3 further sequels and a remake. The sequels have their moments, and I was surprised to hear Sefton Park in Liverpool being mentioned in part 3, but the original is the most iconic and stone cold classic of the series. Illustration on this card is by David Gross. And jumping into the horror personalities subset for this one, we have Transformed Tom and Special Effects Savini, which is obviously effects wizard Tom Savini. I love this card. I think it's so fantastic the way that they got him making himself up to look more like a Garbage Pail Kids version of himself. Any horror fan worth their salt knows who Tom Savini is. To clarify though, he's an effects artist, actor and director. He was a combat photographer in Vietnam who returned and, using what he'd seen over there, developed his special effects skills, ultimately becoming one of the most famous men in his business. His credits include Dawn of the Dead, Creepshow, Friday the 13th, Day of the Dead, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre Part 2, and the Night of the Living Dead remake, and he also appeared as Sex Machine in From Dusk Till Dawn, and that doesn't even scratch the surface. He also cameoed in The Simpsons as himself. I was fortunate enough to meet him back in 2015 at the London Film and Comic Con. He wasn't the most enthusiastic guest I've ever met, but he's so effortlessly cool that it was still a massive thrill to meet him. I'm so over the top in that picture because he literally stood stock still for every photo that was taken, and I thought I'd compensate for the fact that it seems that he didn't really want to be there. That said, I've got massive admiration for the guy, and he's more than earned his place in this set as an icon of horror. Illustration on this card is by David Gross. Sticking with the horror personality subset, we've got Gorging George and Roaming Romero, which is obviously based on legendary director George A. Romero. The design on this card is actually inspired by Dead Ted, a zombie character from the original series of Garbage Pail Kids, which was probably inspired by the work of George Romero in the first place. The late George A. Romero is most famous for his trilogy of the dead, incorporating night, dawn and day. He popularised the zombie, although they're referred to as ghouls in the original Night of the Living Dead, and created much of the tropes and lore that are associated with the creatures to this day. Away from his popular zombie pictures, he directed a film called Martin about a disturbed young man who may or may not be a vampire. a film called Night Riders with Tom Savini about modern-day jousters who use motorbikes, and Creepshow, which he created with Stephen King to homage their love of the EC horror comics. He was an inspiration for Simon Pegg's 2004 film Shaun of the Dead and was referenced heavily within it. He was so flattered that he returned the favour by having Pegg and the director Edgar Wright cameo as zombies in his 2005 film Land of the Dead. Romero passed away in 2017, but his legacy and contribution to horror will stand as long as there are people around to enjoy the genre. Illustration on this card is by Brent Engstrom. Third in the horror personalities comes Joined John and Conflicting Carpenter, which is obviously legendary Halloween director John Carpenter. I like that this card incorporates his greatest hits, including Escape from New York, The Thing, They Live, and Halloween. But I am a wee bit disappointed that they couldn't find a way to incorporate my favourite Carpenter film, Big Trouble in Little China. But it's a cracking illustration anyway. John Carpenter is most famous for creating the 1978 horror film Halloween, along with its iconic theme tune. His other works include Dark Star, Assault on Precinct 13, Escape from New York, They Live, The Thing, The Fog, Big Trouble in Little China, and Prince of Darkness. Carpenter has recently described himself as a semi-retired director. These days, he's taken his love of composing and released several albums of synth-based compositions entitled Lost Themes. He's also contributed to a track by the synthwave group Gunship and narrated the upcoming documentary Rise of the Synths about the modern synthwave genre of music that he himself helped pioneer. Carpenter still tours occasionally, performing extracts from his film soundtracks and tracks from his Lost Themes albums. Tragically, I've missed him twice, so hopefully he'll tour again in the future. He has a really impressive legacy and deserves his place in this set. My personal highlights from his career: Halloween, The Fog, They Live, and Big Trouble in Little China, but any of his films are well worth a look. Illustration on this card is by Brent Engstrom. Jumping back to the 80s horror subset, we have Kill or Be Killian and Bobby Count. So this isn't based on any one film, but it's an encapsulation of the most iconic 80s horror film villains. It's got a feel to the previous John Carpenter card in that it's an amalgamation of different characters. From top left to right, we have Pinhead from 1987's Hellraiser, created by Clive Barker, Michael Myers from 1981's Halloween 2, directed by Rick Rosenthal, and finally Chucky the Doll from 1988's Child's Play, directed by Tom Holland. From bottom left to right, we have Freddy Krueger from 1984's A Nightmare on Elm Street, directed by Wes Craven. Jason Voorhees plays front and centre, sporting his iconic hockey mask look, first seen in 1982's Friday the 13th Part 3, directed by Steve Miner. And finally, Leatherface from the 1986 Texas Chainsaw Massacre sequel, directed by Tobe Hooper. There's so much detail included on this card. Pinhead's robe and puzzle box, Freddy's glove, Chucky's outfit, and Jason's shirt. I love this card. It just sums up how fantastic and iconic 80s horror truly was. The illustration on this card is by Brent Engstrom. Sticking with the 80s horror, we have Ash vs. Ash and Thumb Warren, based on the 1987 film Evil Dead 2, directed by Sam Raimi. This card shows the character of Ash, as played by Bruce Campbell, apparently having a thumb war with his own dismembered hand. This is actually pretty much the same sense of humour that runs throughout the actual film. Evil Dead 2, Dead by Dawn, is a sequel/remake to the original 1981 film The Evil Dead. It centres around our eponymous anti-hero Ash battling the demonic evil dead in an isolated cabin, after resurrecting them by playing a translation of the Necronomicon Ex Mortis Book of the Dead. At one point during the film, Ash's hand becomes possessed and he is forced to cut it off using his chainsaw. However, it's still possessed and continues tormenting him around the cabin, ultimately escaping and responsible for him eventually being catapulted back to medieval times. It also returned in Ash vs. the Evil Dead. It's this entry that defines the Ash character that Bruce Campbell will become famous for. There's a greater emphasis on slapstick comedy and pratfalls, which would continue throughout the sequel, Army of Darkness, and the series, Ash vs. Evil Dead. The elements of humour seen in the original Evil Dead are ramped up here, in keeping with the comedy horror angle which dominated most 80s horror films. Ash is different in that most horror films consider the villain to be the star, but Evil Dead bucks the trends by focusing on Ash as a wisecracking but reluctant everyman hero. He's become a favourite of the horror genre thanks to his one-liners, kick-ass persona and inventive spirit. He loses a hand? Pfft, stick a chainsaw on the stump. In Army of Darkness, he has a prosthetic hand made out of a gauntlet and has several attachments, including the chainsaw, throughout Ash vs. the Evil Dead. Tragically, Bruce Campbell announced recently that he has retired from the character of Ash after the cancellation of Ash vs. Evil Dead. But after 40 years of playing the character, he cemented his right to be included in this set. They've just announced that a fourth Evil Dead film is being planned, but, like the remake, will feature little to no on-screen involvement from Campbell, which doesn't make it feel as special. Illustration on this card is by Brent Engstrom. This is from the cult horror subcategory and is Motel Mel and Hog Wiley, and it's based on the 1980 film Motel Hell by Kevin Connor. Motel Hell appears to be riding on the coattails of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre going off this card. In fact, I believe that Tobe Hooper was approached to direct it at one stage, but ended up passing on it. I mean, indeed, Leatherface's mode of speech simply amounted to pig grunts and garbled noises, so the comparisons against a pig-headed, chainsaw-wielding maniac wouldn't be entirely unfair. Also for the fact that he's a cannibal too. But that's the climax of the film. Preceding that is a really weird black comedy. It's about a roadside motel run by Farmer Vincent and his sister Ida, called Motel Hello, but the O is broken. They set traps on the road to capture people, then bury them up to the necks in a dirt patch, feeding them until they're ready for harvest. And the catchphrase is, "It takes all kinds of critters to make Farmer Vincent's fritters." There's a to-do when Vincent falls in love with and sets out to marry the girlfriend of one of his victims, but he's eventually found out, and the film ends with a punchline to a joke that's been peppered all the way through the film. It's not a bad watch, but looks more late 70s than early 80s. It's got a weird psychedelic vibe to it as well. There's a scene in which they run a light show to the victims, buried up to their necks with nooses around them, and they're giving them a countdown and telling them they're about to go into space. And at the end of the countdown, they drag them out by the nooses using a tractor. It's also hilariously creepy to see the field of people buried up to their necks, all croaking away. Rory Calhoun plays Farmer Vincent and had an extensive career beginning in westerns, but his other genre work includes Hell Comes to Frogtown, Night of the Lepus, and an episode of Tales from the Crypt. However, it's for The Simpsons I'll always remember him for walking on his hind legs. It's definitely a cult film, but Arrow put out a rather nice Blu-ray package of it, and it's worth a go if you can find it cheap enough. Illustration on this card is by David Gross. Here's another from the 80s horror subset. We have Lost Boyd and Upside Down David, based on the 1987 film The Lost Boys by Joel Schumacher. The film follows two brothers, Sam and Michael, who move to a beach town called Santa Carla with their recently divorced mother. Whilst exploring the Funfair boardwalk, Michael spots and falls in love with Star, who happens to be the girlfriend of David, the leader of the titular Lost Boys. Despite an antagonistic start, Michael falls in with the gang and is tricked into drinking David's blood. Sam befriends Edgar and Alan Frog, eccentric brothers who claim to be vampire hunters. They warn Sam that Santa Carla is overrun by them. Sam later finds out that this is true when Michael begins to turn into one. It's then a race against time to kill the head vampire and return Michael's fading humanity. Not so easy when a gang of bloodsuckers invade your home, though. The Lost Boys, like The Goonies, is one of those quintessential 80s films that has left a long legacy to this day. Films with child leads or a group of young friends battling a peril with little to no adult assistance was a staple of 80s movies. Stranger Things owes a lot to films like this and Monster Squad. In fact, if you're a fan of Stranger Things and want to see the legacy, then watch those films because I guarantee these were massive influences on that series. The Lost Boys has also been a big influence on music. There's an amazing music video from the synthwave band Gunship for the song Dark All Day, which is heavily inspired by The Lost Boys. It also references Buffy the Vampire Slayer and From Dusk Till Dawn, but its primary focus is The Lost Boys. It's a cracking tune and an amazing video, and you should definitely check them out. The card is based on Kiefer Sutherland as David, the leader of the Lost Boys gang, and the two additional vampires appear to be based on Brooke McCarter as Paul and Billy Worth as Dwayne, hovering in front of the fairground. There were two sequels released in 2008 and 2010. Corey Feldman and Jameson Newlander reprised the roles of the Frog Brothers, but I haven't seen them. I've not heard great things about them. The Lost Boys is a truly iconic 80s horror and absolutely deserves to be included in this set. Illustration on this card is by Joe Simcoe. We're on the final card of the video now, and this is Foulmouth Freddy and Retching Robert. And this is based on the Nightmare on Elm Street series originated by Wes Craven. Freddy Krueger is arguably the most iconic of all the 1980s horror villains. Only Jason Voorhees really comes close, and Freddy edges over Jason for me personally due to his caustic persona and inventive kill style. However, with 5 films under his belt in the 80s, Freddy made a permanent change to the scarred face of cinema. He wasn't meant to become the rock star of horror he ended up as. Wes Craven had no intention of creating a sequel to A Nightmare on Elm Street. However, it was so successful it made New Line into a major player. Indeed, New Line was dubbed the house that Freddy built, so we're keen to capitalise on the success of the original. The sequels have their moments, but only Part 3 is as well regarded as the original. Robert Englund's portrayal of Freddy changed from a shadowy, rarely seen child killer to the wisecracking star of the show. He became a merchandising phenomenon and kids couldn't get enough of him. From dressing up costumes to rap records, Freddy sold them all. I was fortunate enough to meet Robert Englund back at the 2015 London Film and Comic Con. Seconds before this photo was taken, I stumbled over my own feet and almost landed on that glove. He told me to be careful as it really was genuinely very sharp. There was a slim possibility that I could have been killed that day by Freddy. But what an appropriate way to go. Since the regular series ended in 1991, Robert Englund returned to the role in Wes Craven's New Nightmare, Freddy vs. Jason, and a guest appearance on The Goldbergs. He's since retired from the role though, and was replaced by Jackie Earle Haley in the 2010 remake. They never followed that up though, and despite a good attempt, Robert Englund nailed the part, and nobody could really fill that glove. Illustration on this card is by Joe Simcoe. So that's it! 20 of my favourite stickers from the set and the films that influenced them. I hope that you've enjoyed watching this video as much as I've enjoyed making it. If it's popular enough, I might make another one looking at other stickers in the set and the films behind those too. I want to give a big shout out to Donny36 who I bought the set from off of eBay. The website GPK.com for the artist information. Also, if you want to learn more about Garbage Pail Kids, then that looks to be the definitive site. I also tip my hat to the Tops Chewing Gum Company, all of the artists involved in making the films, music and the photos that I've shown and talked about in this video. I'll be making a follow-up video soon discussing the Garbage Pail Kids movie from 1987, so keep an eye out for that. So while you're here, why not check out some of my horror shorts on the channel? I'll be creating new ones for this year's 15-second horror film challenge very soon, and if you're a filmmaker at any level and want to contribute, it's open submission until October the 15th. So until next time, stay safe gang, and thanks for your company.